posted a guest column at Glenn Lowry's Substack. Glenn Lowry, of course, the great economist and economics professor at Brown University. A friend of his who came of age with Glenn Lowry in the 60s during the actual civil rights movement, named Charles Glenn. He writes, I came of age with the 60s and the awakening concern for social justice. By 63, I was dabbling my feet in the reflecting pool while MLK called for an American future beyond race. Several months later, I was in jail in North Carolina as part of what we called the Freedom Movement. In 1965, the New York Times Magazine used a photo of me and Selma to illustrate an article on, quote, the radical clergy, unquote, priest. I was an adherent of what John McWhorter in Woke Racism, his book, calls first wave anti-racism, which fought slavery and legal segregation. And he writes about what happened in the intervening 50 years. We were right about one big thing in our pursuit of justice in the 70s and wrong about another. What we were right about? The one big thing we were right about is that racial and social class integration can be a very good thing, both for how and what children learn and for the quality of the education provided to poor children. But there's nothing magic about integration, and done poorly, it makes things worse. We found two qualities were essential to the success of integration. Ample opportunities for students to work together on projects and a climate of mutual respect. They got that right, and I agree with them, they did. But it's interesting to be reflective and also say what they got wrong. I grew convinced 4 decades ago, so in the 70s, decade after the Civil Rights Movement, that we were wrong about another big thing, that parents could simply be left out of the consideration, that children were somehow available as an object and instrument of public policy. I came to see through paying attention to what was going on, what was going well, voluntarily chosen magnet schools, for example, and what was going badly, mandatory assignments based on residence, that a successful pursuit of justice should not sacrifice freedom, but should seek to bring these rights into partnership. For more on all of this, pleased to be joined by a gentleman who's written much on the topic. Zaid Jilani is a freelance journalist, maintains his own newsletter where he writes about current affairs at inquiremore.com. That's inquiremore.com. Zaid, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
How do you react to Charles Glenn's comments about what the civil rights movement of the 60s got right and got wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting because we saw over the past week President Biden go down to Georgia, advocate for his voting bill, and more or less compare his opponents, right, to segregationists, to Jim Crow era lawmakers, politicians, and movement leaders. And I think a big part of the reason that, has such a huge space in the American mind is that I think many of us conceive of us as seeing the best and worst of America during that period, right? We see the civil rights movement as noble. We see the segregationists and people standing in the doors of school buildings as, probably some of the worst instincts or aspects of America. So I think because of that, a lot of people today, if they want to be seen as righteous, if they want to see their cause as just, they want to portray themselves as analogous to that civil rights movement, right? And they want to portray their opponents as on the other side of that, right? And I think that's why in debate after debate, it seems like the Democrats are posturing themselves as in that legacy, as in the trajectory of that civil rights movement, even when, in the case of, for instance, Georgia, where I was born and raised, and I know quite a bit about it, now they're comparing writing your ID number on an absentee ballot, and Georgia's had voter ID for maybe 20 years now, around 20 years. They're comparing that to something like the poll test, like the literacy test, like tax of people who are voting, all the Jim Crow era stuff, which obviously did disenfranchise a lot of the people. They're comparing that to things that disenfranchise basically nobody, right? I mean, maybe a handful of people are actually obstructed by these things, and most people do it just fine. And I think so much of that is because there was so much moral weight in the civil rights movement. It really did birth an entire kind of political class in America that I think came out of that civil rights infrastructure and bureaucracy that everyone wants to be seen as associated with it, even when you have to understand something. The civil rights movement was at a very particular time in a very particular place, handling a very particular problem. And I think the problems that we deal with today are just not so simple. They're not so cut and dry as I think that sort of moral clarity was of the civil rights movement. And often, I think, obfuscates things and confuses them to be drawing comparisons from everything that happens today to what happened back then when we actually live in a very different world.
Right. So what do you think the Democratic Party's message is ahead of the 2022 midterms?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think they're trying to figure that out, right? Because I think Joe Biden was essentially elected to return things to normal, right? Political normalcy, meaning he's not going to be tweeting at 3 a.m. People are going to feel more united, feel more comfortable, and also we're going to get past this pandemic, right? But I think that his party has kind of prevented him from doing that because I wouldn't say Democrats are 100% united on this, but everyone in America who wants to continue all these really harsh COVID measures is basically a Democrat, right? And that's his party coalition. Everyone in America who wanted to pass, I think, sweeping legislation on the economy, on voting, they're all Democrats, right? And I think those people have kind of hemmed Biden into where Biden has a hard time arguing to people that he's returning America to normal, that he's bringing normalcy back, when so much of his party basically wants social revolution, right? And I think because of that, their message is kind of twofold. They're trying to argue on the one hand that you're uniting everyone, they're going to bring us back to normal, they're not trying to force things on people, whereas part of the party wants to have bigger and bolder legislation, spend a lot more money, keep all the COVID restrictions going or even escalate them. And I think that has muddled their message ahead of 2022 when the Republicans almost are in the position to say that they're actually the ones that could bring us back to like the pre-2020 normalcy in the economic and public health space.
Yeah, maybe the Democrats are suffering such blowback, Biden in particular, because he's not a very good communicator, as we saw the other day. Maybe because they're violating Americans' innate sense of fairness. And so, on the one hand, the civil rights movement in the 60s is widely understood as on the side of the angels, certainly in 21st century America. On the other hand, manipulating the character scores of Asian Americans so that not too many get into Harvard is not seen on the side of the angels. What you heard from that medical illustrator at Mount Sinai is not seen on the side of the angels. It's seen as actually hearkening back to that civil rights era. It's just a different racial order that is being promoted by a different class of people. And the new racial order, sort of borrowing from Eli Steele's documentary, How Jack Became Black. And so that you're innately an oppressor if you're white, and you're innately a victim if you're minority, and racism is hardwired into the DNA of the country. It's inexorable, and thus revolution is required. And it's revolution to install what? To install a new racial order that was anathema to these civil rights leaders, white and black, of the 60s.
Yeah, I mean, look, after the 2021 Virginia gubernatorial and statewide election, I think Democrats should have really seen a signal in terms of how the median voter feels about this stuff, right? Because I was doing reporting, I think it was probably February or March of last year, 2021, talking to parents in Northern Virginia, and these were largely like South Asian parents, Indians, people from the Far East, who were upset that what they were doing is in a lot of these high-performing high schools, they were trying to change the standards, to change the racial composition of the schools. Because one of them, like the Thomas Jefferson School, it was about 70% Asian, right? And what they did is they got rid of the test standard to try to change the racial demographics of the school. And a lot of these parents were saying, look, we came to America with nothing. We were dirt poor. The only way we had anything in this country is because we worked so hard in education, and you're trying to take this away from us. And these were not hardcore Republicans at all, right? And these weren't right-leaning voters, but a lot of them, I think, ended up going to the polling place and voting for Glenn Youngkin, the Republican for governor, because he said he opposed all this. He said that he supported education, and he supported merit, and he supported everyone getting a fair shot, but not necessarily just giving spots away based on race, which is not exactly what the Democrats were doing, but they were trying to change the formula, basically to change the racial composition, even if they weren't supporting quotas. We all kind of know what they were trying to do. And I think that should have really sent a message to the Democrats nationally, but unfortunately, I think after the election, the Virginia Democrats in particular doubled down on everything. They doubled down on child masking, they doubled down on COVID restrictions, they doubled down on opposing any kind of changes that Youngkin was proposing for the education system to make it, I think, more kind of merit-based and traditionally kind of classically focused. And I think that is a real detriment to the Democrats because they're still in this mindset. Again, when you posture yourself as a civil rights movement, they're thinking that everybody who opposes them is, the white school mom in the 1950s who's standing in front of the school door not letting, minorities in. That's not the situation right now, right? It's a much different situation. But because they can't get themselves out of that mindset, I think they're not seeing why they're starting to lose Asian voters, why they're starting to lose a lot of Latino voters. Because at the end of the day, that is the new American majority, and the new American majority could easily be right-leaning if the Democrats don't pay attention to these issues.
Something else from Charles Glenn's piece I just want to focus on, which I mentioned, is that they got wrong, freezing out parents, that the civil rights movement got wrong, or at least some cohort within that movement got wrong. And it's understandable. I get, he saw this 40 years ago. He saw this in the 70s. I don't think I don't think so many parents have become aware of it until the last few years. And that was, of course, punctuated by Terry McAuliffe's comments in that Virginia gubernatorial race as well. But I mean, this was the left was getting more and more pronounced about parents. You're on the sidelines. I mean, this is from a commercial from Melissa Harris Perry, which became an instant classic. She was formerly an MSNBC host. She said this in a commercial in 2015.
We have never invested as much in public education as we should have because we've always had kind of a private notion of children. Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Once it's everybody's responsibility and not just the households, then we start making better investments.
So that was like It Takes a Village 2.0, and now we're It Takes a Village 3.0, where it's, hey, parents, mind your own business. You don't have any input. You're not an expert. We'll decide the curriculum. We'll decide what your children are taught or indoctrinated, depending on your preferred choice of words. And, you're just somebody they go home to.
Yeah, it's interesting because Nicole Hannah-Jones, who I think is in many ways more extreme than Melissa Harris Perry, she said the New York Times, she actually did say that. She said that parents shouldn't be trying to be involved in curriculum because they're not experts. Teachers are the experts, which is a somewhat absurd statement considering that the purpose of public education has always been a social contract between parents and families and the state, right? Parents are the ones who elect people at the school board, the people who elect the governor and the state legislature to set educational standards. It's always been that compact and that contract, and trying to sever that relationship, I think, is a much newer thing, right? I think we see this most recently there was an NBC News article this week warning about all these bills at the state level that basically would create transparency for school curricula. Like you would have to post like your syllabi or lesson plans or curricula online so parents could just take a look at it. And they were quoting some activists who didn't like this. And, it's so bizarre for a party right now. The Democrats are branding themselves around democracy. But they're so antagonistic to transparency because these are government employees, teachers at public schools, and they're subsidized by taxpayers, and basically everywhere by law you have to send your kids to public schools unless there's an alternative in some states, or you homeschool. So it's compelled and it's subsidized, right? Meaning that everything that it's doing should, with the exception of like some national security exceptions. Like the government is basically subject to the Freedom of Information Act for a reason, because we want to know what we're paying for. And we want to know what people are doing in our name with our tax dollars, with our children, right? That's a basic like democratic idea. And actually some states like Ohio, I think, already have a law in the books that say that you can go to your school board and request any curricular documents you want. So it really is a new turn on the left, I think, to be actively arguing against basic transparency, against this basic responsibility of parents. And to me, it's really destructive because, I actually tutor part-time, and I've taught part-time for quite a while. And one thing I'm sure to do is that when a parent comes to me and asks me about how their kid's doing, I give them as much detail as possible, because it's not necessarily a matter of agreeing on every single thing with the parent, but you need their buy-in for their kid to have a successful education. And so I think this could have a real ripple effect, because it could have parents start to distrust teachers, start to distrust public schools, and you won't have that buy-in that you really need for the kid to succeed. And I think that, it's destructive on multiple levels. For